don't know if y'all can hear that, but somebody's dog is howling. So that might be going on in the background. Anyway, to get this started, I want to set up a little bit of my background coming into what I'm about to talk about here. So in 2021, I got my first book deal. I'm fortunate enough now I've got two book deals as far as novels go. Actually, I've got a couple of others that have either been announced by the time this comes up or in the works and in the background related to short stories and a novella. So I'm saying that out loud is pretty crazy. I'm in an incredibly fortunate place in my life right now when it comes to this writing thing that I love so much and this horror genre that I love so much. Anyway, 2021, I signed my first book deal, and I realized that I had not necessarily been as involved in writing communities as I should have been all along, and as I now wanted to be, especially because now some of that imposter syndrome, even though I'd had short stories published in the past, 2020, while the world was having a catastrophe, a global catastrophe, oddly enough, I was having the best year of my writing life to that point by far, and I'd sold several short stories coming out of a slump of not selling any, so I was really feeling like I had moved past a stage of imposter syndrome that I'd had previously, and maybe even a stage of not feeling like I was as into submitting my writing and putting myself out there as much as I had been in the past. And so now I felt like I had more worth, in this writing realm. And nobody should really feel that way. You should just be involved, get involved, and share your feelings and your thoughts and your experiences in any writing community if they'll accept you and if it's good for you. Then jump in, do that. But I was waiting for a moment like that, I guess, to have it activated that, I can actually do this and be a part of it. And again, that's not necessarily the healthiest approach to it, but also whatever you're comfortable with, right? Don't necessarily put yourself, it's good to step outside of your comfort zone, but don't necessarily put yourself in a situation where you're going to be completely uncomfortable if it's going to be to your detriment. And, I'm getting way outside of what I wanted to talk about here, but this is me a little bit, so this is kind of fitting for the first video. I ramble sometimes. Anyway, I found a group, and I'm not going to name them because I'm not doing this for drama. I'm way less interested in, I'd say, largely, if not entirely, disinterested in drama, and way more interested in ideas and discussion. And so I joined a group that will remain nameless, but that I could have attended some events in person and talked to some people in person. And it was a writing community. And before I got an opportunity to start talking with these people in person, it was 2021, we were getting back into in-person meetings and seeing people. I started receiving, because I signed up online, I started receiving their emails from whoever was operating their organization, small organization. And I noticed something in one of the emails, one of the earliest emails I got, because these were writing advice emails, and I have some opinions about writing advice. When people ask me about it, I've been fortunate enough to go to several events, panels, readings, etc. by now, and I've been asked multiple times what kind of advice I would give to people, and I came up with a mantra for myself in regard to writing advice, which is read less writing advice, read more writing. Hopefully that's going to make more sense by the time I get done talking about this, and in future videos it will continue to make some degree of sense, which is not to say don't read any writing advice. Just read more writing. More writing. If you read the writing itself as opposed to advice about writing, you'll probably, I think, come away with more information and things that are beneficial to you. And that's going to be related to what I'm going to talk about here. I need to get right to it. I apologize. Anyway, I'm looking over to my left here because this is on the screen that has the email that I received that raised some red flags with me and made me think, maybe this is not the place that I want to be in, because again, I'm not into the drama, and I felt like I was going to have to confront the information in this email and try to do it in a way that was hopefully going to be constructive. But you never know how people are going to respond to things, and I was going to be the new guy, and it just felt like all of these things, it probably wasn't going to be worth it. For all I know, I'm completely wrong, and they would have received it with open arms and been completely open-minded and thought, oh man, I never thought of it that way. So I should maybe have given them benefit of the doubt, but in my nature, I was just like, you know, it's probably just not even worth it to bother. So who knows? Anyway, this email says, start at the real beginning. Then it says, compare and contrast opening lines. And these are the openings it gives us for two different books. One says, the first opening, Buck did not read the newspapers, or he would have known that trouble was brewing, not alone for himself, but for every Tidewater dog, strong of muscle and with warm, long hair from Puget Sound to San Diego. Some of y'all might actually know that off the top of your head, some very well-read people. The second one says, this was the second memorable train on which Alex had traveled within the past year. Both had journeyed overnight, but where the first had offered a degree of spacious opulence and old world charm, the second, the Sonderzug, offered nothing at all. Sonderzug, it's German. If I mispronounce that, I apologize. Then it goes on to give commentary about these opening lines that it has just compared and contrasted with, again, the initial body or the initial subject of the email saying start at the real beginning. And it says, nearly the same length, but which one drops the reader into the character and spurs ominous feelings in the first 7 words? Uh-oh versus yawn. Yeah, try that. That's pretty much the entirety of the email. This raised multiple red flags for me personally when I read this. I'm going to start off with the safest or the least of the red flags. The lowest, it's not even full mast, it's not even half mast. It's like quarter mast, and it's not that red. It's some other color. Insert color that is not that red in your mind here. It is the statement, which one drops the reader into the character, spurs ominous feelings, in the first 7 words. First 7 words. 7 words, it's an entirely arbitrary number. And I don't think that they necessarily meant it literally, giving them the benefit of the doubt there. I don't think that they meant actually count the 7 words. But when you're offering writing advice to people, ostensibly a lot of these people not being confident about their writing or seeking some kind of information, you're providing this advice for a reason. So you got to be careful about what you're saying. If you say something as specific as 7 words, some people are going to take that literally. Now, hopefully, if they're paying any amount of attention, they're going to realize pretty early on that this is, in fact, an arbitrary number, because I don't even think the person who wrote this email counted to 7 words. Because based on the position of the 2 paragraphs here, and based on the position of the commentary about which is better, which one drops the reader into character, spurs ominous feelings, uh-oh versus yawn, and also based on the content of these 2 paragraphs in entirety, I think it's safe to say that they think the first paragraph is the better example, and the second one is the quote-unquote yawn example that does not drop the reader into character and spur ominous feelings. But if you read the first 7 words, Buck did not read the newspapers, or he, I believe that's the first 7 words there if I'm counting correctly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah, Buck did not read, that's 4, the newspapers, 6, or, I actually gave him an extra word there. Buck did not read the newspapers, or is the first 7 words of that first paragraph. Second paragraph, this was the second memorable train on which. This was the second, that's 4 words there, memorable train, 6, on. So I for whatever reason, I'm wanting to count 8 instead of 7. Anyway, this was the second memorable train on. This was the second memorable train on versus Buck did not read the newspapers, or. I kind of think, not even kind of, I fully think that the second paragraph there would have been the better example. This was the second memorable train on. At least it's given us an adjective that describes something that sounds like it could be fun. Memorable train. It's the second one as well, so there's been more than one memorable train. I don't know what's happening here. I don't know the name of the character, but I don't know, based on those 7 words, I don't know who this is happening to, but something interesting seems to be happening. It's a memorable train. Buck, I don't know who Buck is, but the fact that they don't read the newspapers doesn't really spur ominous feelings, as it indicates here. It says, in their assessment of it drops the reader into character. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, it does. It gives us a buck right away, although I don't really think I know that much about the character other than he doesn't read the newspaper. And then spurs ominous feelings in the first 7 words. I don't feel like this person didn't read the newspapers or is an ominous feeling at all. Now, beyond that first 7 words, if you get to the next clause in that sentence, or he would have known that trouble was brewing, yeah, sure, that definitely spurs ominous feelings. I mean, it's telling you right there something ominous is afoot, trouble was brewing. But that's not what the first 7 words are. Now, again, I don't necessarily think that they meant that literally, but I do think there's a certain responsibility whenever you're offering advice like this, especially putting it in writing, because I'm probably saying something in the course of this, firing so much of it kind of off the top of my head that could be taken literally and maybe taken out of context a little bit, or not giving me a good faith assessment. That could be bad advice. So, never take one source of advice. Always do your own research, as I'm going to point out here, and kind of make up your own thoughts and construct what it is that's going to be beneficial for you out of whatever information you're receiving. That said, when you're putting it in writing, you're blasting that out as an email, you have time to weigh the words a little bit more, consider the words. They picked the word 7. It might have been just something that popped into their head, but they didn't just say it. They had time to go back, read the email, edit it, determine whether or not this actually makes sense. They didn't even, I fully am confident, they didn't go back and even read between the 2 paragraphs that they're providing here, which of these does what it says, what they're claiming it does in the first 7 words. So, again, nearly the same length. Which one drops the reader into the character, spurs ominous feelings in the first 7 words? I would argue neither really spurs ominous feelings. One kind of drops us into character, but gives us the most bare bones idea of what this character is about, and then they don't read the newspaper, which is going to be an interesting point of view for that when we get into what these where these paragraphs come from. That was my first kind of red flag, because any kind of arbitrary number like that, I'm always just a little bit taken aback when somebody offering writing advice throws out a figure like that, and especially when it's very apparent that even they don't necessarily agree with that figure. The second thing that kind of rubs me the wrong way when it comes to writing advice, any kind of one-size-fits-all advice, I'm always wary of. I understand you're providing these quick emails, this design. This is in the format of some of the other emails that I saw them send prior to this. None with advice that really caused any kind of alerts to go off in my brain that maybe this isn't the right fit for me. But still, they were all pretty short, pretty brief words of advice. I understand. You're trying to be succinct. You're trying to condense some information into an easy, memorable, easily digestible format here, which means you can't provide all the nuance, all the context, all the various examples of this or that in such a tight window here in terms of this small email. That said, nobody's making you write the small email or provide the bite-sized advice. If you're going to do that, you kind of, I think, have to consider the possibility that this little sliver of advice isn't going to necessarily work, not work for everybody, not just talking about the exceptions. This probably doesn't work for a significant chunk of people, and especially when we dive a little bit deeper into what's present here. I think that'll become even more obvious. So I'm always wary of that kind of thing, and I feel like that pops up a lot in writing advice because it's easier to just say the quick, high level, broad brush statement when it comes to advice. Do this, don't do that. Try this, don't try that. This is what to avoid. This is what to always do. Outside of use punctuation properly, which I think is almost universal advice, although I've read some great books that kind of do away with that, but those are usually books written by masters or unique geniuses of writing, and even those have their controversial People don't always view those as universally beloved. So even with that, if you're going to use that exception, you just got to realize that there's going to be potentially a lot of blowback. But that's the only kind of broadly universal advice I think applies. Maybe not the only. See, here I am saying something, using a broad statement like only, when in fact I don't necessarily mean that. So I got to be more careful, right? But I'm saying this off the cuff as opposed to when you're putting it on the page. So I was wary of that. The biggest one, though, for me, the huge one that hopefully you've noticed by now in the midst of all my rambling, maybe you haven't, it's fine. They don't provide the books that this came from. You're providing examples, but they didn't name either of these books. Like I said earlier, that first one, the example that I think that they are in favor of, I think all evidence shows that this is the one that they're in favor of, based on the structure of the email, based on the criticism versus the compliments that they are providing in the email. I think it's pretty obvious that they like that first paragraph better than the second paragraph, and they consider the second paragraph a yawn versus the first paragraph an ominous sense trouble is brewing, as it says in that paragraph. But they didn't tell us what they're comparing. Now, I imagine many people didn't even bother to look this up. Many of the people who received this might not have even really read it and gave it a whole lot of consideration. Who knows? But many people might have read this and not considered the possibility that the titles were being withheld potentially for a reason. Again, giving some benefit of the doubt here, or retroactively doing so, I never went to any of the in-person meetings. So maybe they were reserving this for when you meet in person, and then they would share the examples there. So I went and looked it up. The first one sounded a little familiar to me. I'm not by any means somebody who's just got an automatic encyclopedia of literary references rolling through my head. But this felt like something I'd read in high school, and indeed it was. Buck did not read the newspapers, or he would have known that trouble was brewing, not alone for himself, but for every Tidewater dog. The name Buck, the term dog, these things just, it started, this put some gears in motion in my mind, right? Sure enough, I looked it up. This is from The Call of the Wild, the classic Jack London short novel adventure book about a dog that is basically going to go through a survival journey and discover, the survival techniques necessary out here in the wild, as opposed to the domesticated life it had been living previously, based on circumstances that arise. So that's the first one. That's the one that they say is putting the reader in a position immediately that makes them aware that some trouble is brewing, something ominous is coming. So what about that second one, in which the character Alex, on a memorable train, the second memorable train they had traveled within the past year, both had journeyed overnight, but where the first had offered a degree of spacious opulence and old world charm, the second offered nothing at all. So what about that? She's just describing a train ride. Seems pretty smooth, kind of pleasant. There's no sense of danger. There's no sense of concern. This is why they gave it a yawn. So what is that second one from? Well, if you just try to type that in and search for it in Google, at least in my efforts, regular Google, you don't get any kind of answer. But I went to books.google.com, Google Books, and I typed it in, and it came right up. It's a book called The Night Train to Berlin. And it is a historical romance set in World War II. It is by no means the same kind of book as The Call of the Wild. The Night Train to Berlin, the subtitle on it, when you go to Amazon, the most heartbreaking and gripping historical novel of the year. Heartbreaking is the first adjective they use to sell the book. When you look at the rest of it on Amazon here, a mesmerizing story of love and hope, a train journey into the past, a love that echoes through time. This is a historical romance set against the backdrop of World War II. If you look at the cover, which I'm going to be showing whenever I post this video. You know, you got a couple here kissing on the train. You know, the soldier is on the train. The young lady is kissing him goodbye, presumably here. This is not the same thing as the Call of the Wild. When I go to the Call of the Wild, there's a few different places I can go to for descriptors of the Call of the Wild. It's an older book. It's been in the public domain for a long time now, and it's been re-released through a lot of different imprints. But just to use some of the bigger names here, here's from Penguin 20th Century Classics, which includes it as part of a collection of Jack London stories, including White Fang and others. So it says of the entire collection, it's a bold mix of realism, allegory, adventure, progressive politics, collecting Jack London's most profound and moving works. Specifically about the Call of the Wild, the description, an elemental masterpiece about a dog learning to survive in the wilderness. So pampered Buck is snatched from his home and set to work as a sled dog during the Klondike Gold Rush. This is an adventure story, clearly. For Macmillan, that's from Penguin. Macmillan, their Tor Classics imprint. The Call of the Wild is a classic novel of wilderness adventure from one of the first American writers to achieve international fame. Again, they're using the word adventure because it is an adventure novel. This is an all-ages adventure book, The Call of the Wild. And they are comparing its opening and saying, isn't it more action-packed? That's in a nutshell what they're saying. Not necessarily action-packed, but certainly ominous. There's certainly a sense of danger. There's more danger and concern immediately involved right away in The Call of the Wild as opposed to this other book. And it doesn't bother to name either one of them because I think most people would immediately realize if you said compare these two openings and see how this one has more danger and this one doesn't. A lot of people would immediately say, well, yeah, one of them is an adventure book and the other one is a romance book. This would be like comparing the opening moments, the opening 10 minutes of Raiders of the Lost Ark to the opening 10 minutes of From Here to Eternity. Wow, one of them had so much danger and a sense of fun. There were multiple betrayals right away. A man has to run away from a boulder. He has to use his whip. This guy's on this crazy adventure in the wild, in the jungle, and then he barely escapes on a plane with his friend, and even as he escapes, there's a snake in the plane with him, and he's terrified of snakes. And the other one just has a guy showing up on a military base and having several conversations with people, and somebody offers him a chance to do some boxing, but he turns down the chance to do some boxing. There's no danger there. I mean, the war is about to happen, right? Pearl Harbor is on the horizon, and yet, where's any sense of that danger? Why don't we have any ominous moments? It's just a conversation. Yet one, again, historical, romantic drama, one all-ages adventure story. These are very different things. That said, even if it's in the same general genre of film or anything, genre of storytelling, I say film because I'm using film examples off the top of my head, even though I'm going to get to some literary ones a little bit later because I'm working on video here. It's a visual medium, so I feel like some early examples using film just kind of suit the medium a little better. But if you go into that, right? Take the openings of The Godfather and the opening of Goodfellas. These are very different things. The Godfather, both of them have famous openings. Goodfellas opens with the continuation of a murder and a guy getting stabbed and shot to death in a trunk of a car because he was making too much noise when the people that are transporting him to bury him realize he's still alive. The Godfather, conversely, opens with a monologue from, I don't know, the 15th to 20th most important character in the movie.
I believe in America. America has made my fortune. And I raised my daughter in the American fashion. I gave her freedom, but I taught her never to dishonor her family.
I believe he's a funeral director, right? Eventually he gets summoned to deal with the fact that Santino's been slaughtered, he's been massacred. Look how they massacred my boy. And he's the one who is, because he owes the Godfather a favor, because the Godfather sees to it that the men who wronged this, the young men who wronged this man's daughter and who assaulted her, sees to it that they're punished in an extrajudicial way, as only a mob boss could. And so then when he says that you're going to owe me a favor, and when he calls in that favor later on in the book, it's not some like grand, amazing moment. I'm going to need a favor from you, and you're going to sneak a bomb in to kill our enemies or something. Sets this up kind of early on in the story. This is the first character who says any lines, I believe in America, comes from this gentleman. And he's talking to our title character, the Godfather himself. And he's telling him, I believe in America. Then he goes into the story about his daughter. He tried to raise her in a way like the American fashion. Let her go on these dates, but then these boys do something terrible to her. How can I get this retribution? Because the law has not seen to it in a way that has satisfied what I feel is justice. Vito says, I got you, but you're going to owe me a favor. And so we spend the movie wondering what that favor is going to be. Well, the favor comes into play later in a really, I think, amazing scene. Look how they massacred my boy. Can you fix him up some kind of way? Do your best. He says, I'll do my best, you know.
Look how they massacred my boy.
At that point, Vito just gets to be a father, grieving over what happened to his child. Meeting again with the man who opened the movie, who was a father grieving over what happened to his child. It connects them in this excellent way. I think it's wonderful storytelling. But if you were to compare and contrast these in terms of which one opens in a more ominous way, as illustrated in that email there, which one drops the reader into the characters that are most important and central to the story and gives us a sense of uh-oh, and gives us a sense of trouble brewing and danger. Well, obviously it's The Godfather. And obviously it's Goodfellas. And The Godfather, in contrast, doesn't really give us any sense of danger at all, and doesn't pay off later with this character in any kind of way that enhances or features any sense of trouble or danger. And obviously, that's fine. Both of them are classic openings. These are in the same general genre of film. One is, if you were to break it down and really just get into the minutia of it, probably you'd call there's no real subgenre like this, but you'd call, in terms of the adjectives, you'd call Goodfellas the grittier film, obviously rooted more in reality. Godfather is almost more of a gangster fantasy, and kind of an epic. Either way, though, they're both gangster movies, and they open in these very different ways. Totally fine. Even if you go beyond that, and just not even into the aspect of it as, okay, well, these are two different films. Two films made by, in the same, not just the same genre, in the same series of films. Godfather 1 versus Godfather 2. You want to talk about opening with danger. Signora Andolini, Vito's mother, who doesn't even get a name in the story, and I want to go on my own little rant about her, the same way that Hyman Roth gave the rant about Mo Green. There's not even a statue or a plaque or what have you to commemorate this man who did all this. Signora Andolini in Godfather 2 saves Vito's life, goes into the den, the lion's den, of the people who've killed her husband and one of her other sons. The youngest son, I got to get him. We got to save him. He's all I have left. He's not gonna do any harm. And then ends up having to hold a knife to that man's neck when he says, no, I'm not going to have any mercy. She has to hold a knife to his neck, tell her son to run so she could save his life, and she still doesn't even really get a name. But that's how that movie opens. Godfather 2 opens with that, which is so different, obviously, from the much, more, how do you even describe it? Like just the much more kind of eased into opening for The Godfather. The initial film is almost a misdirection. Again, we're talking to, at best, the 15th most important character. I've given this a little bit of thought, and I talked about this a little bit with my friend Peter Roche. What's up, Peter? And we were starting to count through all the characters, and I think because of the scene later on, I kind of inflate a little bit of his importance. It might be like the 20th most important character, the funeral director. Either way, is he? I don't think he's an undertaker. I don't think that's it. And I can't think of the name right now. I don't think it's not coroner either. Anyway, mortician. Is that it? It's mortician. I don't know why that word was escaping me. I'm a writer. You know what? I'm not so much of a talker. I'm a writer. If I was in front of a screen typing it up right now, the word would have came to me. Now I'm on camera, spotlight's on me, words escape me. Anyway, the contrast between opening with Vito's mother saving his life and the mortician, just telling the Godfather this story that we don't really see pay off on screen. And when he comes back in, it's not in any way to help Vito and the rest of the Corleone family enact revenge for what has happened. He's not utilizing him in any way that really moves the story truly forward. It's for a character moment. That's fine too. And so I point all this out because there are obviously multiple ways to effectively open your story. It depends on the kind of story you're telling. Maybe open it with action and a sense of a threat and a sense of menace and give people a sense of foreboding and, oh God, what's going to happen? Or maybe you just establish it with, hey, there are some people getting on a train and this is going to be fun, and it's a beautiful train. It's more opulent than the previous one they were on, because we're just beginning the story. By the way, that opening that reference from the Night Train to Berlin, that's in the prologue too. That's not even in chapter 1. There's a whole other discussion about our prologues. I mean, obviously prologues are basically the beginning of the story, but at the same time they're designed to be skipped a little bit. So, not necessarily skipped, but they're prologue for a reason. They're not chapter 1, so it's precursor to what's happening, central to the story. So there's a little bit of an idea of, like, if you skip the prologue, you probably aren't missing a whole lot within the story. Like, if I'm not mistaken, the prologue to Salem's Lot is kind of a flash forward, and that's my favorite Stephen King book. That's a little bit of a flash forward. If you were to skip it, you're not really missing the essentials of the story necessarily. You could probably get away with it, and that's kind of the nature of prologues. That's an entirely different discussion. I don't need to get further off base than I'm maybe already starting to here. So you have kind of this, hopefully, baseline of an idea of your opening, how to start your opening and how not to start your opening, based on some advice. Might be something you just need to internally consider more so than just reading advice somebody else gives, especially based on what I think is kind of, again, I don't want to disparage anybody, and I'm obviously not even naming this person, so I don't really think I can throw them under the bus, because select few people even have read this email and can trace it, and they might not even see this, so who knows. Like, this video is probably going to get like 500 views or some crap. But when somebody's giving you advice, but they're not willing to give you the sources of the examples that they're using, pretty huge red flag. They obviously should be providing that for you. They shouldn't be counting on you to go research it yourself. Or they, at minimum, should be saying, here are the resources with which to research it yourself. I encourage you to research it yourself and do this on your own if that's part of the exercise. Or, at minimum, just, even if they don't give you the resources, just say, hey, go research this yourself. They didn't give any of that. It was just straightforward advice of this is the bad way, this is the good way, and these are the examples, and don't ask anything else. All of this kind of reminded me, when I saw this, related, not a direct, one-to-one kind of connection here, but related. It all kind of reminded me of when I was more active in an online writing community when I was much younger, in my 20s. I'm in my mid-40s now, so it shows you how much time has passed then. But there was a website that I used to frequent, but I used to go there mostly for talk on politics. I would stay in the horror section because I'm a horror writer and I'm a horror lover, and I like a lot of different genres, but horror is my home base and where my heart, generally speaking, is, although, again, I love a lot of different things. But I would stay over there, and I would not really go into the kind of writing exercises, writing prompts section. And then one day, because the nature of the site was old school internet forum style, you could see a lot of different titles of a thread posted, even if you are just passing through. And one day one caught my eye, and it was like an opening line contest. And I don't know how often people still may or may not engage in this. I don't know if this was just a thing that was happening back then, and maybe people have gotten away from this style of critique and contest, informal contest, because it wasn't like there was any prize money or anything on the line. It was just, hey, amongst ourselves, let's vote. And I don't even know if they were really doing an official vote, but it was like opening line contest for your book in this thread. And a guy had posted something. When I dove in, for whatever reason it caught my eye, I decided to click on it for the first time. I'd never really gone to this part of the site. And I went in there to check, and the latest one that somebody had submitted was this guy who had basically said, this is the opening line to my spy novel. And he opened the spy novel, if I'm not mistaken, if I'm remembering correctly, I think there was something about a character in bed staring and thinking about the clock, the alarm clock beside his bed. And something about the numbers and the color of the numbers, something along those lines, if I'm not mistaken. That's the way I remember it in my head anyway. It was something along those lines. And that was it. And one of the first responses he got was somebody saying, if I read this, I would not be able to tell that this was a spy thriller if I read this opening line. And I remember thinking, when I read that critique, nobody reads books that way. We're putting undue weight on the opening line at this point to say there's already so much weight that's put on people's opening lines that I feel like is exaggerated at this point. I leading up to this video, which I've wanted to do for a little while, I started testing some of my friends in the writing community, people that I know just in general in my life, readers, and I started asking, what was your favorite book from the last year, last couple of years, what was your favorite book of all time, etc. They tell me, then I would ask, do you know the opening line, like off the top of your head? Because some of them are very famous. Some are quotable, some are in that it was the best of times, it was the worst of times lane, that category. Stephen King, I keep going back to Stephen King. Interestingly, from one of the books that I haven't read of King, because it's one of those that I just haven't gotten around to yet. But the entire Dark Tower series has just kind of not been in my rotation at all. But I am aware of the opening from the first book, the famous opening, the man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed. So and I might not have gotten that quote exactly 100% right, but I know that that's the general quote. And that one's pretty famous, especially among people that are big fans of King and big fans of the Dark Tower series. Most other books, my favorite's Salem's Lot. I've read it a few times. I couldn't tell you the opening of that book. One of my favorite ghost stories, Michelle Paver's Dark Matter. I love that book. That's the opening line. I couldn't tell you what that opening line is off the top of my head. Michael McDowell's The Elementals, another one of my favorites. I've read it multiple times. I feel like the opening line is Savage Mothers Eat Their Children, because that's a great line that I love in that book. I don't think that's the opening line, though. I feel like I always think it is in my head, and then I go back and when I reread it, I'm like, oh yeah, that's not the opening line. But I love it so much, I've told myself that it's the opening line. There are several others, though, that books that I love. I'm looking across at my bookshelf right now that you guys can't see off camera, and I'm looking at Mexican Gothic, recent books. Mexican Gothic, love that book, read it a couple of times, couldn't for the life of you tell you what the opening line is. Ghost Eaters, love that book, couldn't tell you. And again, Do You Want to Get Haunted is one of the famous lines, or one of the great lines, kind of the catchphrase from that book. I don't think that's the opening line, though. When I asked all of my colleagues, and all the other readers that I sampled for this as well, most of them, the overwhelming majority of them, couldn't tell me the opening line from their favorite book from the last year, their opening line from their favorite book from the last 5 years, 10 years, all time sometimes. They're like, man, I've read this thing 10 times. I don't think of the opening line, though. It's not like I'm trying to commit that to memory. It doesn't have to be something that you absolutely have to remember. And it definitely doesn't have to communicate the entire genre of the story in the opening line, like in that example I cited from that website that I used to visit. That blew my mind that not only somebody said it, but basically everybody else in that thread, the people that were frequenters of that section of the site, tended to agree. Yes, this person's right. Your opening line needs to have that kind of impact and communicate immediately what kind of story this is. People don't read that way. You know what kind of story it is going into it. You've read the back of the book. You know the blurbs, you know the title. You go into it, you know, oh, this is what I'm getting into. So I don't need to be told in the opening sentence, or the opening paragraph even, or even the opening page, exactly what the story is, and it has to leap right into it right there. And if it doesn't leap into it right there, then it's a fail. I remember reading that and then wanting to comment on that, just by the way, back then, but then the guy who was being critiqued, the guy who'd written the spy novel, he responded with some very personal insults for the people that gave him that advice. And so it became a situation where it was like, I agree with you in terms of your like this is bad advice, but the way you responded, if I come back in now and agree with you, it looks like I'm also agreeing with your the ad hominem attacks, and I obviously don't agree with that. So I was like, this is why I don't come to this part of the website, and then I just let it be, and I never said anything about it. But it did just strike me as bizarre that this is the way people think, as if people are out here in bookstores picking up a book blindly. Even if you have that thing now, the modern thing that people do, the kind of blind date with a book, the book is usually wrapped in like a paper bag style cover, and just completely blotted out as far as any sense of the title of the book. You might get a description, you might not. You just have to kind of pick it up based on a recommendation maybe from the bookseller. Even in those situations, when you get the book finally at home, you open it up, you take off that cover that makes it the blind date. You're still going to read the title. You're going to know who the author is and whether or not you're familiar with their work. You're going to read the back of the book. You're going to read the blurbs and the quotes, and somebody's going to say this is a thriller, this is exciting, this is heartbreaking. You're going to know the nature of the book. Nobody just picks up a book completely blind with no idea of what they're going to get into, reads the first sentence, much less, the first sentence or the first paragraph, and says, oh, this doesn't tell me exactly what's happening. Next. I'm out of here. No, I'm not going to do that. Some books dive right into it like that. Some don't. That's okay. Some more examples in the book realm. I'll read this opening. At 11:32 a.m., man passed the truck. Some of you guys might just be able to guess what that is based on context clues. Some people watching this might know that from context clues. Some people might just know it off the top of their head. Again, there are some people that are like that. But based on some context clues of me being a horror reader and horror fan, and the scary girl behind me probably gives some of that away. The doll face here. And so you might be able to glean from there, oh, what kind of horror stories involve a truck? Pick it up from there. But I think a lot of people, I might have given you the clues already, enough to pick that up, but I think a lot of people might not know that immediately. Continues, he was heading west en route to San Francisco. It was Thursday and unreasonably hot for April. He had his suit coat off, his tie removed, and his shirt collar opened, his sleeve cuffs folded back. There was sunlight on his left arm and on part of his lap. He could feel the heat of it through his dark trousers as he drove along the 2-lane highway. For the past 20 minutes, he had not seen another vehicle going in either direction. So this is from Richard Matheson's Duel, which is a very condensed, amazing thriller. There's not a lot of space for side stories, B-plot, anything along those lines in Duel. It is I think it's a novella, it's not even a full novel. And it is very intense, and it gets right into the action. I think a lot of people would describe it as propulsive and continuously so. Really, again, intense, getting into the action early. And yet, in that first sentence and in that first paragraph, while it does identify the truck that is probably going to be, that you could gain a sense of being probably the menace if you go into the book knowing what you're getting into. It does make mention of that. If you were to read it blindly in the kind of way that you would have to read it for the advice of this needs to get me right into the story immediately and I need to know what's going on immediately, the way it would have to be presented if that advice were to be taken at face value, then saying that he passed the truck at a certain time of day doesn't really actually tell you anything. The reason why it tells you so much is because going into Duel, this is the story about a man against basically a truck, technically a truck driver, but the driver is never really identified at all, and it's basically the truck itself. For all you know, it feels like, it's not, but it almost feels like the truck is controlling the driver as opposed to vice versa, in what man is going to get himself into over the course of this incredible story. But that opening paragraph that I just read, there's nothing about it that indicates what specifically the type of story it is and what we're about to get into. If you were reading it blindly, and if somebody had submitted that opening line to that contest and said, this is the opening line to my horror thriller, at 11:32 a.m., man passed the truck. That's the opening sentence. People would have flayed that opening sentence. The people that were saying, this doesn't tell me what this is about, would have said even more so, to that opening line. How do I even know that this is a horror story? This just sounds like a guy on a road trip. Yeah, it's a horror story about a guy on a road trip. You know what you're going to know going into the book? That it's a horror story about a guy on the road against this truck. That's the way people actually read. They don't read just entirely based on, well, if this opening line doesn't blow me away and tell me everything I need to know immediately, then I'm trashing this and I'm moving on to something else. At least nobody that I've ever met reads that way. Maybe you know somebody in your life, unfortunately, that reads that way, and in which case, I don't think I would take any reading recommendations from them. Another Richard Matheson book that I think is a little bit more on the underrated side from him. Someone is Bleeding, another novella, I believe. I don't think it's quite a full-length novel. It was a pretty brisky day. Excuse me. It was a pretty brisk day, as I recall. Sky a little overhung, the Palisades grayish behind the mist. I suppose that's why the beach wasn't too crowded. Then again, it was a weekday, and school hadn't let out yet. June. Put them together, and what have you got? Then the next sentence, a long stretch of beach with just her and me. That's the opening, really 2 paragraphs, or opening paragraph and an extra sentence, of his novel, or novella, Someone is Bleeding. Based on that, you would just think this is a pleasant stroll on the beach that a guy is talking about with some lady that he's probably happy to be there with. And that does tell part of the story, in fact, in Someone is Bleeding. But because you know it's Richard Matheson, because you know the genre of the story, and because the title is called Someone is Bleeding, and by the way, I didn't even mention this, you've also seen the cover of the book. And the cover of the book, if you're an ordinary reader, if you're like 99.99999% of readers, and not that 1 in a million who's like, no, if it's not the opening line capturing me immediately and telling me everything I need to know and dropping me in and into the character, and I need to know how ominous and threatening everything is immediately, if you're not like that and you're just willing to engage in this journey because you've read some things about the book, even if it's as little as the back of the book and a couple of blurbs in the title of the book, you've also seen the cover, and there's probably something on the cover indicating the tone, the genre, the style of the story being told. You've seen all these things. You've put all this together. You know that you don't need to be immediately blown away in those opening lines. So all of this, I feel like I've gotten more fired up than I even anticipated getting into this. But I love this stuff. I love talking about this kind of stuff. And I'm not into this for drama by any means. And I'm not even really into it for heavy negativity. So future videos that I plan to post are going to toggle somewhat between some of this writing advice that I want to pump the brakes on a little bit, or just say, do a little bit more, dig a little bit deeper before you just immediately take the advice at face value. That's really the crux of what I'm getting at when I say read more writing instead of writing advice. Don't just forego the writing advice. By all means, continue to read some writing advice and receive some writing advice. Go to your creative writing classes, listen to those teachers. A lot of them give wonderful advice. That said, the good ones are also going to encourage you to actually read. I've never encountered or talked to anybody who's a good creative writing instructor, whether they're doing an official class or just kind of a more tutoring online situation, whatever the case may be, just providing general advice. I haven't heard of anyone just saying, here are some examples of what to do, here's some examples of what not to do. No, I'm not going to tell you where I got these sources from, and no, I'm not even going to encourage you to go look it up on your own. So just, being mindful about all of these things. But I'm just, in the future, I am going to probably dive a little bit more into some of these, but I'm also going to talk about things. My next video I plan to talk about are just things that I find interesting and fun when it comes to storytelling, whether it's in film, television, literature, what have you, even down to the marketing. My next video, I want to get into some things I find interesting about trailers, and specifically to horror fiction trailers. I really do. I have a passion for it because I don't really know what I'm doing, right? I'm, trying to just hopefully come up with stories that people really enjoy. My way isn't necessarily the right way to do things. Somebody else's isn't necessarily the right way to do things. There are a lot of different avenues for success, right? My first 2 books probably fit in more the category of immediately bringing you into a situation or a character where the threat is very obvious, immediate. in the opening lines, but that's just my style. So if anybody should be actually in favor of this kind of advice, if you got to jump right into it, what are the characters saying immediately, and how how threatening, how menacing is the story immediately, I should be in favor of that kind of style. But I'm not going to sit here and tell it to you as if my way is the absolute definitive only way of going about this, and I'm the only person who knows what they're doing, or I'm one of the only people who knows what they're doing. I'm incredibly fortunate that I've got 2 books out. I've got a third on the way that also has probably an opening paragraph that jumps right into it. My 4th book, I think, has the best opening line maybe that I've written thus far, and I was really proud of it. Again, this actually, that advice suits my style, but I also know that it's suiting my style for my stories, which might not suit your style for your stories. You've got to figure it out for yourself. And for me, not just providing that advice, that what I think works for me. And I feel like that's where a lot of this advice comes from people, and they mean well, I'm sure. I want to give people, again, that benefit of the doubt. I do think they mean well, but I think a lot of the time people don't set aside personal preference to actually pay attention to what is the overall reality of what is going to make you potentially successful. And so the reason why I said that, I say I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what does or doesn't make something successful. None of us really do. Stephen King himself, I keep going back to it. I can't help it. What do you want me to say? In On Writing, there's a section in On Writing, one of the really great books written by somebody who's mega successful about the craft of writing. And he says at one point that kind of even he doesn't necessarily always feel like he knows what he's doing, that writers in general don't know what they're doing in terms of what is going to work. What will the audience connect with 100%? There are people who have mastered a formula, and then they can replicate that formula time and time again. And so in that sense, you can have an idea of what you're doing. If you're trying to do something a little bit different every time, though, and you're trying to dive into different stories and in different paths and engage in different things, different emotions, maybe even switch genres from time to time, the idea of, I absolutely 100% know the audience is going to connect with this or that. I talk to a lot of people who are just like, hey, man, we're trying, and at the end of the day, you got to write what you feel. You got to write what's important to you, and that's the same thing for your opening. So, I titled this video. I think I'm going to title this video, "How Not to Open Your Book," and put that in quotation marks, because you got to try and get some engagement some kind of way. And for whatever reason, the negative tends to draw people in, make people immediately want to say, well, I immediately disagree with that. And I'm sure some people will disagree with this. Who knows? But I'm going to put that in quotation marks because this isn't really about that. This is more about combating the idea of what not to do. The thing I would say not to do is to not take advice that disregards different genres and different styles of stories. Will have different types of openings that work better for them. If somebody's giving you advice that doesn't take that into account, don't open your book based on that advice. Unless it does end up working for you. Caveat. If it does end up working for you, then replicate the things that work for you by all means, if that's the path. Because it's really difficult, and there's no certainty in terms of, even if you write something really good, you might not, just because of timing, bad luck, what have you, you might not find the audience that you deserve. It's difficult to assess what is going to make you successful. So if you find something that does work for you, it makes you successful in whatever way you've determined is going to be success for you, however you measure it, by all means follow that and disregard the advice that I just gave. But generally, what I would say is read more writing. If somebody gives you examples and they try not to give you the sources of those examples, either ask them for those sources or do the research on your own, but just take it in consideration that there's probably a reason why they're hiding it, because I know if you find these examples, you'll be able to start picking apart what it is that they've said, and maybe they're not ready for that discussion, they're not ready for that conversation and that consideration, and they're just trying to dispense this quick hit advice and then just move on and hope that nobody else is going to actually do any kind of digging into it. And I would not recommend starting your book based on advice that's provided that way. I would recommend also not starting your book with the thought that if this opening line doesn't convey everything that the book is about and doesn't immediately capture the reader in the first sentence, then I've done something wrong and it's a mistake. That's fine. It's fine. If you have a killer opening, by all means go with it. If you have an opening that is going to be legendary and is going to be memorable and people are going to be able to fire it off the top of their head. When my first book, The Spite House, I was trying to do a Shirley Jackson impression from The Haunting of Hill House because I love that opening. Even though I can't precisely quote it, if somebody starts reading it, it's like, oh yeah, all familiar. I would know it off the top of my head. And I know that it talks about Hill House, or it talks about things that cannot exist under conditions of absolute sanity. Even things that are the subject of dreams are thought to dream, basically. Even fantasy items are thought to dream. And then Hill House, not sane. Otherwise you go insane if you're not able to sleep and dream a little bit. And then the scariest 4 words, I think, in maybe all of horror, Hill House, not sane. I was able to commiserate with somebody at StokerCon, the big horror convention a few years ago on that. The fact that Hill House, not sane, conveys so much in just 4 words based on what precedes it in the 2 sentences prior to it. And I was trying to do a kind of gentle, weak impression of that with The Spite House, not a definitive impression necessarily of it, but something about the haunted house that I was conveying, and I wanted people to understand that there's a menace immediately present here, and I thought I had something good there. And the late, amazing Weston Oakes, horror author, veteran, who had seen and read it all, basically. I only got to meet him once, but I met him at the Tucson Book Festival a few years ago before he'd passed, and that was a highlight. So far, meeting him and his wife Yvonne still continues to be a highlight of my early career here. And he was his first time, obviously, seeing my book, and we were on a panel together. The next day after we'd done the panel, having to catch him walking around, and he said, that was some opening. That's a hell of an opening to your book you got there, Johnny. It's kind of made my day. What else do I need to have said to me? So thanks again to Weston, R.I.P., for that. But again, I say that to bring back up, this is the style that I wanted, and I got some encouragement from a veteran legend in the horror space about that style of opening. And even though that all would put me in league to be biased toward the idea of your openings need to be like this, I still don't adhere to that advice, because different people are going to write different styles of stories, and your style of story, you just need to open it wherever you see fit. And then the last piece of advice I give about, or I would give about this kind of thing, even if you are determined, I need to have a killer opening line. I want my opening line to be so amazing. I'm just looking over to my left here. This is my first time doing one of these, doing anything like this. I got in my head, I got real paranoid. I was like, what if I've been talking all this time and I forgot to turn the mic on, but my recording is there, so I'm good. Almost. I would have. You guys wouldn't know, but I would have, as the kids say, crashed out if that had not been recording this whole time, and then nobody would ever know because this video wouldn't be out there. Maybe I'd just put out the video of me just not saying anything the whole time as like an art project almost. Anyway, my last bit of advice when it comes to the opening line, if you're feeling like I really want to have a killer opening line, that's fine if you do feel like that. Just remember also, you're probably going to have to rewrite everything anyway. So if you don't have the opening line right away, come back to it. You're going to have to come back around and probably re-edit. I know my opening line for The Spite House, my opening line for my second book, Devils Kill Devils, I've had to come back and rewrite things, including that opening line. That's part of the process. So don't get paralyzed in terms of beginning your story, because I have talked to people who think, man, I've tried to think of my opening line and I can't move forward because I want it to be great, but I can't think of just the right thing to say, and I get stuck on that. I've talked to a few different people who've told me that, and I just say, well, just come back to it. It'll be waiting for you. Move on to the rest of the story. You're going to have to rewrite everything anyway. Let's come back to that opening line. Make it a killer later. And then, if it's killer, that's awesome. If it's not quite killer, if it's just good, if it's just getting the reader into the story, if you're trying to write an entire book, you don't have to necessarily put all that weight into the opening line. Put the weight into the story entire. So, anyway, I picked up my little glass here. I thought it was getting a little bit parched, so I'm going to drink some whiskey, like old school. And that'll quench your thirst right there. I would not recommend that. Don't take that advice either. Be healthier than me. That's it. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. And I'll see you guys in the future.